Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We will kick things off soon, but as we are kind of waiting for everybody to jump on the link, you know the deal. I want to see how everyone's going, what's been happening. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. How's everything been? Has the weather been bad? This morning I woke up to dark skies as per usual. You know, the time has changed now, so this is what we have to live with. But it stayed dark until about 8 o'clock. So it was a very somber, sad morning that I started with. But hopefully you have some sunshine wherever you are in the Manawatu region. Yeah, it's just been cold and rainy all week. We are going to get into a very interesting topic today where we are looking at, smaller businesses, you hiring your first employee. What do you do? It's quite daunting and exciting at the same time. But with that, there were a few things that I kind of read yesterday, which was really interesting. There was an article that was put out by a retail association, and they were effectively saying that there are a lot of retailers out there, a lot of employers that are saying the leave liability for casual employees is just through the roof for them. And also for sick leave and for permanent employees, they're saying 400% liability is what they're looking at now, and that's how much they've had to up their costs to cover these 10 days of sick leave that employees are entitled to. Now, if you didn't know that, we will be getting into that. So I'm really glad that you are here and that you are joining us for this webinar. What I will do is I will just double check to see how many of you guys are actually on, and we can kick things off, I think, now. So I'll get things started, get things underway, because I know Bernie, our lovely event specialist, is in the background. She'll answer your logistical questions. She will be the taskmaster today to say, Sanam, stop yapping. Let's keep it moving. So welcome, everyone. Kia ora. I'm so glad that you have joined us today for this webinar on basically everything that you need to know to really kickstart your process when you're looking at hiring an employee and bringing them on board for the first time. It is for people out there that might be new employers, and also for people that want to check their processes. See if you've been doing the right thing, if everything's been going to plan and it's exactly, what you should be doing and what you have expected to be doing this entire time. And if you have any particular, questions or anything like that, you can absolutely ask them as the presentation goes through. So you may be wondering who's speaking, what's going on. Well, my name is Sanam. I work as the Employment Counsel here at Employment Hero, and I am New Zealand based, and I eat, live, and breathe employment law in New Zealand. And what that means is that all I do is talk about it 24/7. So I think I am well fitted to run this webinar, I hope. If I'm not, then let me know definitely in the chat. I know somebody said that the chat function is not is disabled, so please use the Q&A function. I'll get into it a little bit more about that as we kind of move on through. So just a reminder, this is all recorded. You guys will be able to access this at any point in time. So make sure that you are kind of sitting back, taking it easy, and just writing down the notes that you really need to write down. This will be sent out to you as a recording with the link and everything, as well as some extra fact sheets and bits of information. I know Bernie's been working on a few things, so very exciting stuff that we're going to be sending out. So keep that in mind and just keep an eye out after the webinar. It might take a couple of days or so, but it will definitely land in your inboxes. So as I said, this is a Q&A. So please, as we go through, write your questions down, send them in. No question is absolutely ridiculous. I love getting the questions. It gives us a chance to test the waters and see what people are dealing with on a day-to-day. So feel free to pop those in. And as part of my spiel, I always have to say that this webinar is provided to you in good faith. So please, if you are looking for specific legal advice or anything like that, then we do have a HR advisory service which you can tap into if you are a new employer or you're an employer that feels very overwhelmed. I get it. It's not easy navigating this space. So absolutely reach out or just drop something in the Q&A and we can reach out to you directly. So with that said, let's talk about what we're actually going to cover. Now, hiring is broad. We know that there is so much you can cover under that department and that area of law, but I wanted to contain it to types of workers, employer responsibilities, all about leave, all the way through to good faith. And hopefully that will give you the basics that you need to kind of kickstart things and really understand that you're abiding by the obligations that you're meant to, and also making sure that you're meeting those responsibilities and requirements. So let's kick things off by looking at the types of workers. Now, Basically, there are a few types of workers and common types of workers across New Zealand. I wanted to hone in on the most common ones that we see time and time again. Now, please keep in mind that apprentices, trainees, paid internships, all of that good stuff, that is not in this. But if you have any questions around it, feel free to drop it in the chat. We can definitely see if we can get to it towards the end. Now, in terms of common worker types, there is a huge issue in New Zealand, Australia, so many countries around misclassification of a worker. And it's the fact that you're kind of in a situation where you think the relationship is one thing and then it kind of becomes something else, and no one really signed up for that. So that's what ends up happening. And unfortunately, it can happen in personal relationships and it can also happen when it comes to employment. So let's get into the different worker types that can come up. And these are not necessarily employees, all of them. They're just different types of workers that can be present in your workplaces. And like I said, apprentices, trainees, all of that are other worker types as well. And they're not necessarily your stock standard, employee. And we'll kick things off by looking at permanent employment, because that worker type is very, very common. It's probably the most common across New Zealand. And it's all about a person that has ongoing employment. There is no specific end date to their employment. You need to be making sure that they are fully aware that they're meant to be coming into work, that they've got set hours for their work. And that can be a bit varying here and there from week to week, but generally they need to be either part-time or full-time. So that doesn't mean necessarily that there is a clear definition, and not a clear definition of what part-time is or full-time. In New Zealand, actually, there is nothing. So you could have somebody on 5 hours a week or 40 hours a week, and they could still be a permanent employee. It's more around the agreement they signed and the way that you are bringing them on board and engaging them every day in the relationship. With that said, though, the complete opposite to that is a casual employee. And this is a very, very commonly, done wrong kind of thing when it comes to New Zealand employment law. And it's just because of the fact that a lot of people confuse casual employment with people that are part-time. Now, casual employees, they are very, very different. Like I said, with part-time, there's no definition. So they are a permanent employee and they can have 5 hours a week of work or 2 hours a week of work, whatever you guys agree to. With casual employment, because the numbers can be so low at times, people think that, look, they are, a casual employee if they're working every Monday, 2 hours a day. If that is the case, then after a while, there becomes a pattern of work. And that's when they move out of the realm of being a casual into a permanent. So with casual employment, it's all about making sure that the person works sporadically. They work when it suits them, and they also work when it suits you. And they can absolutely turn down work, which is very different to a permanent employee. If you had an employee that you knew was meant to come in tomorrow and they turned around and said, yeah, I'm not really coming in because I'm working somewhere else, that's going to be a bit of an issue, right? Whereas with the casual, they can decline shifts. The whole point is that there is no pattern of work. There's no expectation that they will have ongoing work. And then we move on to fixed term employment. So you've got permanent, set in stone, no end date. You know that they are going to be on your books for the long haul. Then you've got casual employment. They're sporadic, no pattern of work. There's no ongoing employment. And now you've got fixed term. So fixed term is an interesting one because, again, this is sometimes applied incorrectly. And you can have a temporary employment with the fixed term. And usually what that means is that you need a genuine business reason. So you need a genuine business reason where you might be needing somebody to cover a person that's going on parental leave, for example, or a long period of leave. Or maybe you have a situation where you have a particular project coming up. So I'll give you an example. Many, many years ago, I dealt with a client that was building yachts and boats. And the yacht industry, unfortunately, as much as we see it on The Real Housewives, they're not churning out yachts constantly. So they would build these boats and then there would be lull periods for months in between. So they would bring on a fixed term employee to specifically work on that project, that particular boat. And then when that fixed term ended, because the project was finished, then everybody would part ways. So that's usually how it works. And it can be for a secondment as well or something like that. But usually there has to be a genuine reason. You're not just doing it to trial out the person or to test the waters. And the last type of worker, which, like I said, not all of these are employees, is an independent contractor. Now, contractor and a contractor misclassification, huge issue in New Zealand Zealand. I've seen it so much throughout my career, and it's because contractors can slowly become more like an employee because of blurred lines. And it's interesting when you see that transition happen because it just happens slowly and steadily, and it's not something you anticipate. A lot of the contractor relationships that I've seen in my career have started off as genuine contractors. You know, they've started off with the intention that they have a business, that they're going to be providing a service, but that slowly morphs. So what a contractor actually is somebody that's usually self-employed. They invoice you. You have no control over them. And I know that this is not the world we live in right now. So please don't take me as being naive. But if I can boil it down to as simple as what a contractor should be, if I had a broken window in my home, I hope I don't have a broken window, but if I did, then hopefully I would call in a contractor to come in, take a look, and price give me a quote, tell me how much that's going to cost. And then from there, it would be that the contractor quotes me, invoices me, does the service. They need to come in when they want. They bring their own tools to fix that window, to bring in their own glass and everything, and charges me for those materials. So that is how it should work. And unfortunately, the definition doesn't change when you're in a workplace or in a different scenario. It's the same definition. It may change with the new Employment Relations Amendment Bill that's come out, but for now, the law stands as it is, and it means that you shouldn't have control over that person. That person needs to just be able to come in and get whatever job they've got to do done, because it's based on the deliverables, what they're actually giving you, rather than based on the hours that they're working or their performance per se. So that's why it's very different. And usually a telltale sign is that when they become integral to your business, they start hanging around with the team. They, are working a 9 to 5 all of a sudden. They're using your company tools and everything. It starts looking more and more like they are an employee. So definitely be careful with that. Misclassification is such a common issue, but that is why you're here, because we're going to go through all of this and really break it all down. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to tie in to each different type of employment. So keep this in mind as well. And you'll always have this, like I said, we'll send out these slides and the presentation recording as well. So we'll move on to the next thing, which is employer responsibilities. Now, employer responsibilities are vast. There's so many things that you're going to have to do as an employer. I don't want to scare you. Don't worry. There's a lot of people out there that haven't attended this webinar and they've hired their employees. So you're definitely one step ahead. So with employer responsibilities, I didn't want to get into all of them, the health and safety. There's so many areas. So I thought, why not contain it to certain things like rest and meal breaks, your minimum wage, your recording, your time recording requirements, all of those things. So let's kick it off by looking at minimum wage. Now, minimum wage, stock standard, most people across New Zealand are at least getting the adult minimum wage, and employees that are not getting the adult minimum wage might be somebody that are starting out or somebody that are on the training wage. Now, those wages are lower and they are usually only applicable in certain scenarios. So for a starting out wage, you would only provide that to an employee that might be 16 or 17 who hasn't actually worked for you for 6 months. Now, once they work for you for 6 months, it ticks over to the adult minimum wage. And it doesn't mean that they have been in the industry or working for 6 months. It's just for you for 6 months. So keep that in mind. When I worked as a legal advisor for the hospitality sector, I would see it time and time again, lots of people from school wanting, their after school job and things like that. So they would be 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds going into the workforce, and they would be on that starting out wage, and then they would tick over. Now, the training wage, like I said, we're not talking about apprentices or trainees in this particular webinar, but that's where the training wage would apply. They would also get a training wage if they were an apprentice or a trainee that was part of an industry trade organization. So if you were a construction worker or a hairdresser, you might be moving into that kind of industry, which means that there will be certain coursework and training that you will need to do. And as part of that, it kind of removes you from the workplace slightly, and you're also learning and doing work at the same time. So that's why the wage is a bit lower. So with that said, it's really important to make sure that you've got your wage rates right and you're at least paying the minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage goes up well, it has gone up every year, year on year, on the 1st of April. So I would always recommend mark your calendars a month before. Make sure that you're fully aware of the wage changes that are going to come up. And if you have anyone on a salary, make sure you review what their minimum wage actually is, because all of a sudden they're starting to work more hours. Then you've got them maybe working 50 hours a week when it should have been 35 or 40. And now the wage technically has come down if you look at it by hour in their salary, right? So because of that, I would always recommend making sure that you reassess. Just take a month before to, not the entire month, but you take a look a month before and make sure that you kind of go through and have a look at everything, and you feel comfortable about the fact that you've moved everybody up and if they need to get a pay increase because of that minimum wage change. Now, with that, one of the top tips that I'm going to give you, and to be honest, there are a few tips in here that are not on the slides, and I wanted to just kind of give this to you ad lib as we kind of go through, is making sure that you send out your variation letters and notify the employee that the minimum wage will change. You'd be surprised. There are some employees that do not like the pay increase. I just had a question that came up from somebody else outside of work that asked around what happens if an employee refuses to get a pay increase. So it does happen, and just make sure that that you are navigating that space by giving them letters notifying them beforehand. So with that said, let's go ahead and move forward with hours of work. Now, hand in hand, your minimum wage goes perfectly in hand with your hours of work. And why is because you won't know exactly what you need to pay them for the week or for the day or whatever if you don't know the hours of work that they are meant to do. So with permanent and fixed term employees, you have minimum guaranteed hours. It's really important to fix this down and to really understand that the minimum guaranteed hours are what you provide to the employee and what the employee is willing to do. Now, they're minimum, which means that at a minimum, if you put 20 in the employment agreement, you have to provide them with 20 hours of work. They can absolutely say no and decline a shift if they want to, and say that they won't be able to come in on that day. If they can't, then that would be annual leave or unpaid leave, however, sick leave, whatever the reasoning is behind that. But you need to make sure that at a minimum, you are giving them those hours. And what that means is that usually in certain industries, the hours can fluctuate, right? Depending on if you're in hospitality, sometimes if you're in tourism, all those sectors can have varying hours. And because of that, it's really important to try to keep the hours tied to as close to what they normally do on a week-to-week basis. Because the last thing that you want is for the contract to say 20 hours a week, but the employee's actually been doing 35 hours, because then that's a huge discrepancy. And now you're going to have to average out hours if every week it's fluctuating. So try to really hone it down and stick to as closely as you can provide at a minimum and what they would accept as well. Now, there are a couple of weird and wacky rules when it comes to New Zealand's employment law. And it's because I say weird and wacky, not because it's a bad thing, but because it's not actually contained in the Employment Relations Act. We don't have it in the Holidays Act. We have a separate piece of legislation which talks about wage, and minimum wage and things like that. And we have something contained in the legislation around fixing hours of work. But it reads really weird because what it says is that you should fix the hours of work at 40 hours, but if the employee agrees to have that extended out or they agree to 50 hours, then that's fine. That's the contract, that's all good. So there is actually a hard or fast rule that you have to cap it at a certain amount of weeks, a certain amount of hours. Whereas in Australia, there is a very clear cap. It has to be a certain amount of hours per week. And the other side of it being weird and wacky is that if you have somebody that's working less than 40 hours, it's important that you try, and that's a very critical word, try to fix these hours over 5 days. Now, the reality is that every workplace is different. And yes, you can, speak to your employee. As long as you're on the same page, you reach agreement, everything's kosher, it's all in writing, you're good to go. But if you have any issues where there is a contention in the workplace or the employee saying that, no, I should have been paid this many hours, I wasn't given any breaks or anything like that, that's where this usually kicks up. So it's best to get everything down in your employment agreements, have it all very clearly laid out. You don't, like I said, need to fix the hours over 5 days. If you are doing a job where it's 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, you can split it out over the 7 days and give them their rest and meal breaks and make sure that they have breaks between their shifts and all of that to still factor in the health and safety side of things. So it is possible and doable, and it's not illegal in New Zealand. So just keep that in mind. And what we'll do is we'll move on to the third component, which is what I just touched on, which is rest and meal breaks. Now, this changed and shook New Zealand a while ago. This was, I think, I was like, the ripe old age of my early 20s, living the dream. And that's when this all, changed, and it kind of shook up the fact that employees can't just go ahead and work through their rest and meal breaks and then go, hey, I'd just like to wrap up half an hour early today, if that's all right. Or, I'd like to wrap up an hour early. That used to be very common. I don't know about you, but I used to do that all the time when I worked in private practice. I'd be like, yep, let's power it through. And then I can knock off a bit earlier, because who wants to sit in a dark, dingy office until like 4 a.m.? No one. So that was what I saw back in the day, and it's what was very much common practice. But now the laws have very clearly changed. This has been set in stone for a very long time, and it's been well before COVID that this came into place. And the whole idea about this is that employers and employees need to agree on when their rest and meal breaks are taken. But the issue that comes up still to this day, and we actually had a partnering client actually ask this question through our partnering service at Employment Hero and our advisory service. So the NZ advisory team actually reached out and said, what happens when we've got an employee that actually doesn't want to take their rest and meal breaks? They're not actually showing up or wanting to engage in that in any capacity. And unfortunately, the responsibility is on the employer. So you need to make sure that if you can't get onto the same page, that you come to some sort of agreement with the employee. Now, if it's an outright refusal, I would suggest you get some legal advice around that. You might need to go down a disciplinary path or something like that, but speak to the advisory team at Employment Hero, or speak to a lawyer or somebody that can help you navigate that space. But normally what we know is that if you can't reach agreement, the law has clearly laid out, thankfully, exactly how these breaks should be taken, and you need to stick to them if you can't reach an agreement. The easiest one to explain is an 8-hour day, and that is where in the middle of the day, right smack bang in the middle of that shift, you would do an unpaid 30-minute lunch break. Some companies decide to pay their employees. Make sure that you've got that all written into the employment agreement if you're going to choose to do that. And then on either side of the lunch break that you get, that meal break, on either side of that, right in the middle between the time you start and go to your lunch break, or where you have your lunch break and you finish, you need to have a 10-minute break in the middle there. That could be, and this is a paid break. It's usually a smoker break, or people go in to grab a cup of coffee or something like that. So usually you'll see that earlier on in the day and in the morning. So that's the way that it would normally work. And with your 6-hour day, again, it's the same thing. It's just that you get less of the rest break, and you get one rest break and you get one meal break there. So it's really important to make sure that you've understood the obligations, that you don't have an employee coming back and saying, you never provided me with my rest and meal breaks. It's usually what I see. One of the first cases that I ever dealt with was a wage claim issue, and a lot of it rested on the fact that the employee was saying they were never given their rest and meal breaks, and the employer had no evidence of that either. So I would highly recommend making sure that you document it, whether it's a clock in, clock out system, whether there's even just a digital system where they can just put in exactly when their rest and meal breaks were taken. In the hospo sector, I would see a lot of falsification of timesheets. So that's also really critical as well, that you want a system which is really going to give you the most accurate information rather than relying on employees to provide you that information. But that is just my 2 cents as a jaded lawyer that has seen this many, many times go wrong. So aside from that, something to keep in mind, which a lot of employers don't know about, is that when it comes to breastfeeding, employers are required to provide facilities for women who want to breastfeed. That means providing them with a room, as well as providing them with unpaid break times to be able to go and express their milk. Now, what is really interesting is many years ago, I spoke on a panel from Employment Hero, and it was at one of the conferences. And on that panel was somebody that worked at NZ Steel. And it was so fascinating to hear how the plant was actually distributed over kilometers of land, which meant that a lot of these workers that were female, if they needed to breastfeed, they would have to travel almost 45 minutes to get to the main factory so that they could express their milk. What the company did was they created a portable refrigeration system and made sure that there was a breastfeeding facility in every part of the plant so that women could easily, quickly duck in, take their break, and duck back out and do all of that. So there are requirements, and it's just about whatever works in your workplace, doesn't take too much time away from work, and also makes it something that's convenient for the person that is breastfeeding as well. So just keep that in mind, and we'll move on to all about leave. I had a little bit of a giggle when I came up with this title. Bernie, if you're laughing in the background, laugh along. I thought it was really good. I also wanted to make sure that I had the name right according to the movie, and I did, so that was very well done. Now, I wanted to talk about leave because leave is a critical area for all of you employers out there. It is the thing that causes a lot of wage claims. It is the issue that comes up, and like I said in the beginning of this webinar, if you weren't there, I wasn't talking about anything in particular about the presentation. It was actually the fact that I saw an article last night around the retail sector saying 400% has gone up in terms of my liability to pay for sick leave and things. So it is something that is onerous on an employer. It does take a toll. So hopefully this will give you a bit of peace of mind and understanding around what these leave obligations and entitlements are. I won't get into all of the calculation and all of that nitty-gritty, but I will get into the general idea of the entitlement and some top tips around how to handle certain things. So with annual leave, let's kick it off by looking at a stock standard permanent employee. They're not casual, they're not working intermittently or irregularly. You've got very straightforward, you've got an employee that's on fixed hours every week, minimum guaranteed hours. They would normally get 4 weeks of annual leave for continuously working for a 12-month period. So what that means is that the employee, once they hit that 12-month mark, they will get 4 weeks of annual leave to them. So they get that. So the way that I look at it is throughout the whole year, you have a lovely piece of chocolate cake, and you keep adding bits and bits of that chocolate cake until you get to the end of the year where you have all of a sudden a full cake ready to go. All the pieces are aligned. You've got everything ready. And that means that now the employee has an entire cake to themselves. There's a couple of ways that employers in New Zealand tackle this. And the first is actually not allowing the whole cake to be eaten, at the 12-month mark. They actually allow for pieces of that cake to be taken throughout the year. And that means that the employee at the 3-month mark might have accrued, is the wording that we usually use, some of their annual leave. And they can take it kind of as it comes up or as they accrue it. Now, the issue with that, though, is that a lot of people use accrued leave and think that that is what the leave is. But there's no actual definition of accrued leave as much as there is that you're actually giving leave in advance. So if you think about it, if you're only entitled to 4 weeks at a 12-month mark and you're giving it to them beforehand, then you are giving them leave in advance. So just keep that in mind. There is provisions in the legislation. This is a top tip from me, that there is something in the Holidays Act that says that if you've given employees leave in advance, so they've taken their leave before that 12-month mark hitting, then that means that you would just need to basically deduct any of the advance leave that was given to them, or they just get paid their 8% for that year if they wrap up beforehand. So there is definitely provisions in the legislation that protect you around that, but just keep that in mind that you can do it either way. So you can either wait for that 12 months to tick over. A lot of employers don't, to be honest. So you might look like a bit of a taskmaster if you do that, or you can just give it to them as they accrue it bit by bit throughout the year, and your payroll systems will be able to do that. Now, there is a whole other section of the legislation when it comes to the Holidays Act, which deals with people that work very intermittently, they work irregularly, and what are we thinking of? Hopefully a casual. And that means that they get pay as you go. So PAYG is what we normally, call it. the lingo, but pay as you go is the 8% of gross earnings that they would receive instead of getting their 4 weeks paid annual holidays. And normally you would qualify for this if you work so irregularly or so intermittently that it's really impractical for you to say, okay, this is your 4 week entitlement. And usually what you will see is if somebody's on a genuine fixed term, so like I mentioned before, let's say you've got somebody that's gone on a period of extended leave or maybe a sabbatical or something like that, and you've had to bring someone in to cover them for that time. If it's less than 12 months, then you can absolutely give them the 8% pay as you go rather than doing the 4 weeks annual leave. Now, the reason why it caps it at 12 months is because you can have some fixed terms that might last a year and a half, for example, as long as it's genuine. So just keep that in mind. There are two classes of annual leave that can kind of come up: the annual holidays, where you get 4 weeks, and you also have a situation where you can have pay as you go for those people that are very irregular in their hours of work and with their patterns of work and everything like that. So that is the annual leave component. Now, I'm going to flick between these slides a little bit because the lovely Bernie has put together this top bit here. Hopefully you can see it. That top bit at the top basically gives a great idea of the next few bits of leave that we're going to talk about, which is family violence, bereavement, and sick leave. Now, why I say that top bit is great is because it doesn't matter which level of leave we're looking at, whether it's bereavement leave, sick leave, or family violence leave. That is the standard for how an employee becomes eligible to those particular types of leave. So all employees, whether they're permanent, fixed term, whether they're part-time, we know that there's no clear definition around that, or whether they're casual, they can use bereavement leave or sick leave or family violence leave if they have continuously worked for the business. So for you, for 6 months, or if they have worked for you for 6 months and it was for an average of 10 hours per week. And that means that at least 1 hour in every week had to have been worked, or 40 hours in every month was worked by that employee. So those are the criteria. So either 6 months continuous employment, or you might have a scenario where you've got somebody working 10 hours a week. And also that means at least 1 hour in each week is done. And that means 40 hours in total of that month has been worked by that particular person. Why do they have that? To capture the fact that you have casual employees. So when a casual employee starts not looking like casual anymore, they tick over, and these are the areas where you get a little bit caught out, where you need to start paying them these additional leave and all of these different things. Now, you could have a true casual, and they could be working 1 hour every week, 40 hours every month, and they could be working an average of 10 hours per week because you could have them on different days. But the reality is normally what starts happening is they start looking a little bit more permanent. But like I said, you can have it on a completely above board situation as well. So with that said, just keep that in mind as the test. I won't hammer into it too much each time as we talk about each leave. But what I will do is kick it off by talking about sick leave. Now, sick leave has been the hot button topic of this webinar, clearly, because I've brought it up a few times. But sick leave is something that your employees may be entitled to as long as you meet that criteria. And what is sick leave usually used for? It's for illness and injury. And it's not only for the employee. It could be if the employee has to take care of themselves, their partners, children, other dependents. So keep that in mind. And with the world that we are in now, and with the heightened sense of mental health concerns and issues, it doesn't necessarily mean an illness as in you're sick, you've got the flu, or that you have an injury like you've hurt your hand or something like that. It could mean mental health days and all of those additional factors as well. So keep that in mind. Don't just box it in to it only being all about the fact that you are looking at an injury or an illness specifically. Now, with this particular entitlement, employees are given 10 days of sick leave per year once they reach that criteria that we mentioned in the beginning. And once you get your 10 days of sick leave per year, that actually will tick over to the next year if you haven't used it as an employee. And that means you get a maximum of 20 days sick leave. So that is a maximum entitlement that you will be able to get. It can't keep building up past that unless, of course, you use your leave, drops down, and then it will replenish back up to 20. So the Holidays Act, something to keep in mind, and I wanted to throw this into the slides as well, is that it does not actually define sick leave in hours or weeks or anything like that. It's just days. So you as an employer can choose whether you want to provide your employees with part days so that they can go off to a doctor's appointment if they're feeling unwell or something like that, or you can choose to do it as full days. Whatever you decide, because a lot of employers out there are choosing to do part days and things like that, just make sure that you have a clear policy. It can be in your handbook, it can be in your house rules, however you want to wrap it up, but have a leave policy in there which touches on all of these different things. And what you'd also like to add into the leave policy is the medical certificate side of things too. So with the medical certificate, what we've got is a lot of employers thinking that they can't actually request for a medical certificate, especially if the employee has been unwell for a day or a couple of days. But the actual law and the legislation does allow you as an employer to request for a medical certificate. And you can also ask the employee to go out and get one if they've been away from work or they say that they're sick. Now, if it's less than 3 days, the employer will foot the bill of that medical certificate. So that means the cost of them going to a doctor to go and speak to the medical practitioner and pay for that, which we know can skyrocket sometimes. And if they go to any of the White Cross or anything like that, we know like it can be really high. So if that is the case, then just keep in mind that the employer foots the bill if it's 3 or more days in a row. And that doesn't mean that the employee has needed to work on those particular days. So the way that I would look at it is, let's say the employee's shift was on a Friday and they're unwell, they call in sick, then all of a sudden the weekend ticks over, then on Monday they're still unwell. If it's that's still 3 or more days, and maybe the weekend they weren't meant to work anyways, it's still 3 consecutive days in a row. If that's the case, then the employee foots the bill. So look, there's a lot of advice around how to navigate around this. What I would say is that if you've got a difficult employee and somebody that's consistently away sick, try to figure out and get down to the bottom of it. But sometimes you just have employees that misuse their sick leave. And if that's the case, then sometimes requesting those medical certificates will really make sure that they kind of understand that they can't take this for a ride, and that you are kind of putting your foot down. So it can be a good tactic to use, but use with caution. And if you need anything, like I said, reach out to a legal advisor or speak to our HR advisory team. Now, the next component of leave is bereavement leave, and this is another one that is commonly, misconstrued, and a lot of people don't understand it. Actually, I realized how much people didn't understand this from an employee perspective until one day I spoke to my father-in-law, and my father-in-law said, his cousin had passed away, and my father-in-law said, well, I can't take bereavement leave, right? Because there was already a death in the family like 11 months ago. And I said, well, no, that's not how that works. So let me break it down for you in case you were a little bit confused about how this all works as well. So again, you need to meet that criteria at the top to be eligible as an employee. But for an employer, what's important to keep in mind is that employees can take a minimum of 3 days bereavement leave for each bereavement. So that is really critical, not per year, not per month or anything like that, for each bereavement. And that means that if you have a scenario where an employee may have extended family that has passed away, or even close family, you might be needing to give them 1 or 3 days bereavement leave, depending on the scenario. So the 3 days only comes up when you have immediate family that passes away. So usually what happens in this case is that you've got a parent, a child, a partner, spouse, grandparent, somebody that fits that relationship to the employee. That's when you would have 3 days bereavement leave. That it also extends out to if the employee has a miscarriage or a stillbirth, or if they know somebody that was their partner, former partner, primary carer that experienced that as well. So that is usually quite clear cut. You don't have any kind of ambiguity when you know that this is the particular relationship that the person has. Now, where it gets a bit tricky is the 1 day of bereavement leave. You can under the legislation, you have to provide a day of bereavement leave, depending on how close the person was to their deceased to the deceased person. So depending on how close the employee was to them. And It usually rests on how much they're involved in the funeral proceedings, how much they're involved in the arrangements, the ceremony, if there's any cultural responsibilities, and also the relationship to the person that's passed away. Now, the reason why this is really important, and it can always become a bit gray, is because you have so many different cultures. Indian culture, Maori culture, so many different cultures where people are raised by aunties or extended family that are significantly close to them but don't fit the mold of your immediate family member. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you have these conversations. Be quite sensitive in your conversations with the employee, just because of the circumstances and given the situation. But remember that it is not capped at a particular a particular time, and there's no rule around 3 days every 12 months or anything like that. What I would like to also say is that with the bereavement leave, a question that actually came up by a local business owner last week, I was just traveling through town, and somebody that owns a local business said, look, we've got an employee that actually took last week off for their shift, saying that they had suffered a bereavement and they had 2 days of work back to back. And this week they called up and said, hey, I was just wondering if I can take another day of bereavement leave for my grandma passing away, who passed away last week. And the reality is, yes, you have to give the employee 3 days. It doesn't have to be 3 consecutive days. And that's to account for cultural differences. For ceremonies, you might have a 12-month prayer meeting or something that's held, and that's where the employee can use that additional bereavement day later on, rather than doing 3 days back to back. So keep that in mind, because it does come up from time to time where employees are questioning it. And of course, they can jump onto the Employment NZ website and have a look at that and test the waters with that as well. So the next thing I wanted to get into was family violence leave. I know that we are pressed for time, so I'll try to breeze through this. This is, again, same criteria. Employees can take 10 days of paid family violence leave per year, and it doesn't roll over or anything like that. It's just 10 days per year if they've experienced family violence themselves, or they have a child who has experienced family violence and lives with them. And it doesn't mean that they have to be there all the time. And it also doesn't matter when this family violence took place. So just keep that in mind. And it's 10 days. I have heard through a lot of different people that this is coming up a little bit more and more, and it is something that you definitely have to be mindful of as an employer. So the next thing I want to talk about, which is outside of leave but kind of ties into the wages and things like that, is around public holidays. So your entitlement is really interesting when it comes to a public holiday, because we think stock standard maximum 12 public holidays per year. But what it all falls and rests on is an employee's day that they would normally come into work. So what we classify it is as otherwise working day. And what that effectively means is, if the public holiday falls, let's say today on a Wednesday, was the employee normally supposed to come in on a Wednesday and work? And that will be your determining factor to figure out if the employee should be coming in for work, if they should have a paid day off, and if they come in, how will their entitlement be, or how will their public holiday be paid? So I'll get into a little bit around that. So if you have an employee that would have normally worked on the public holiday, so like I said, let's take today as a public holiday, then if you don't expect the employee to come in, they would get a paid day off. It wouldn't be annual leave or anything like that. It would be a paid day off for the public holiday. If they were meant to work today, and you are fully open, running your business, maybe doing a bit of a surcharge, whatever it is, then you need the employee to come in, and that means they would get paid time and a half, and they would also get a lieu day, which is an alternative day. So that would give them an extra day that they can use later on down the track for taking their time. The time and a half only gets paid for the hours that they would be at work, not for the hours that they might have done, the week before on a Wednesday. So just for the hours that are worked on that day. So sometimes I've worked in industries, when I worked in advisory, we had advisors come in on public holidays because everybody needs advice. Employers need advice on public holidays. So we would be there on the phones, and we might only work 4 hours in rotational shifts, but that meant 4 hours at time and a half, and we'd get a lieu day as well. So just keep that in mind. And this is something that will come up. Now, otherwise working days are really difficult to pin down. And there are certain, if you've got an employee that's working variable rosters and variable shifts, but it's important to make sure that you are looking at the employment agreement, you are checking the pattern of work, making sure that they have worked previously on these Wednesdays, for example, and that they are meant to be coming in on that Wednesday. Now, there is no hard or fast rule on exactly how you need to go back and have a look, but I would usually recommend going back and looking at least a couple of months back. And some cases we've seen that have gone to the courts, they've said go 3 to 6 months back and have a look at how often the employee on average worked on a Wednesday, for example, to determine whether the public holiday applies to them. So just keep that in mind. The last thing for this bit I wanted to talk about was record keeping. Now, this is something where a lot of employers don't know that you actually do not legally need to provide your employee with a payslip. I know that's really bizarre, but you don't legally need to do that. However, where there is a catch in the Employment Relations Act is the fact that you need to actually have wage and time records on hand, and you need to supply them in a timely manner if the employee requests them. Not to mention, recent changes to worker protection legislation has meant that if a labor inspectorate or an immigration officer or anybody who comes into the workplace in that capacity, you have to provide them with wage and time records within 10 working days. So it's a time crunch, and it's not the time for all of your wage and time records to be all over the place in multiple different systems. So why is this important? Because even when the employment ends, an employer is meant to keep wage and time records for up to 6 years. So that means that from the date that you've seen the employee from when they've kickstarted employment, 6 years is when you need to keep their wage and time records. And it's really critical because if a labor inspectorate comes in, they, whether it's a random audit or a tip off or whatever it is, they will peel back the books and have a look at all of this information. So even though you don't need to give your pay slips, I highly recommend doing it because at the end of the day, it's a way for the employee to have transparency around what they're getting paid. There won't be as much ambiguity and they won't have any questions, but also making sure that you have your wage and time records to hand, ready to go if anybody comes in and questions anything, including the employee. So last bit, as I'm breezing through, we're going to talk about is good faith. This is one where no one talks about good faith, but good faith is critical for your employment relationships. It is so important because it is the backbone of our legislation that governs your employment relationships and everything. Unlike a lot of other countries in the world, New Zealand is one of the only countries that has a good faith requirement, which means that the employer and employee need to follow 3 key principles. And that's why you always hear when there's a restructure or a redundancy or something like that, that you've got employees saying that they wanted to be consulted with. We need to get their feedback. Same thing with the disciplinary as well, that you've laid everything out for them. That's not because of the process needing to look like that as much as it is about the good faith obligation. So obviously, as the cases have come out, now the process is that, but good faith is the thing that underpins it. And like I said, there's 3 key principles. So the first thing is that all parties, meaning you as the employer and the employee, need to act in a way that's not misleading and that's not deceptive. You also need to make sure that you are responsive and communicative, and you need to make sure that if you are, as an employer, making any decision that's going to adversely affect them, meaning you're going to end their employment, give them, a situation where they might be on a first and final written warning or anything like that, you need to make sure that you have given them all of the information up front. I mean, everything up front for them to really consider it and be able to comment and provide their feedback. And that's why you see this so heavily, scrutinized when it comes to disciplinaries, to performance management processes, all the way through to redundancies and restructures. Because again, it's literally the thing that protects mostly the employee, and I would say the employer to a certain extent as well. Now, one of the top tips I would mention here is that try not to have your good faith requirements mentioned in the employment agreement. And it's because it's already legislated. But if you don't, as an employer, meet certain obligations, the employee can come after you for breach of contract. I know, it's crazy. So make sure that you remove it out of your employment agreements. Remember, it's still a part of the day-to-day and everything that needs to happen in the employment relationship because it is legislated. So there is a statutory, legislative requirement, which kind of trumps the employment agreement. So just keep that in mind. Now, if we look at what good faith looks like in practice, I wanted to give you two examples where it's not disciplinary related, not performance related, and it actually ties in to what we've been talking about today. The first one is length and timing of rest and meal breaks. So it's all about looking at whether an employee and employer can agree to a rest and meal break timing. If they can't, then the whole premise of the legislation says that you need to negotiate in good faith, which means that you need to be not misleading, not deceptive. You need to be responsive, communicative. You can't have one party going, I don't want to deal with this. You need to make sure that you're having these conversations. And then the second example would be transferring a public holiday. So sometimes employees, they don't want to take a day off on a public holiday. That would be an otherwise working day for them. They want to actually come in and work, but they want to transfer that public holiday to a different date. Maybe Christmas is not as significant to them and they want to do Eid or Diwali or something like that instead. So if that's the case, then you can agree with the employee on transferring the public holiday. Issue with that though is, again, you need to make sure that it's considered in good faith, which means that you can't just shut it down. You've got to be open-minded, you've got to be responsive, communicative, and you need to make sure that you are not misleading them in any way. So those are a couple of examples in practice. Now, I think that basically wraps us up. Hopefully I haven't breezed through it too much, and this was quite useful. What I'll do is I'll get into the Q&A component, and while we're in the Q&A component, I will go through some of the questions that have popped up. So we have one question, which is, can we ask proof of death before giving bereavement leave? Oh, man, I had this on my list of questions just in case if this was going to come up. And to be honest, it's a tricky one. And I tell you why. The legislation, the Holidays Act, does not provide a duty on the employee to provide this evidence. It does not say anything around that proof needs to be provided or that the employee needs to supply this. Whereas when we look at family violence leave, the employer can request for proof of this, and family violence leave can be taken in accordance with the proof being provided. With bereavement leave, it's not the same. So I would say tread with caution. It is a very tricky area, and even if you ask the employee and they refuse, there is no legal obligation for them to provide it. So it's hard to go down that path and to actually have that conversation because it will kind of lead nowhere. So I would recommend being careful around that, trying maybe not to go down that path initially, and seeing what else would be the better way to maybe communicate with the employee. If you feel like there's misuse of bereavement leave or something, then that's a different conversation to have. Now, when we have a look at another one of the questions, sorry, I'm just reading through them. So if somebody asked around a sick leave for other family members, if a partner has if your employee has a partner whose mum or dad is in hospital or has had a stroke or anything like that, in that scenario, it would be how close in proximity the person is, if they are a dependent, if they need to provide, care for them or anything like that. That's where they could be captured under that particular legislation. So just make sure that you're looking at it in that particular way of how much responsibility does this individual have in their partner's parents or their in-laws, hospitalization. So another question that has come up is, what if an employee refuses to take their breaks? Look, I think I would be treading into legal advice if I gave you an exact blow by blow of what needs to happen. But what I can say is that you first need to try to come to an agreement with the employee. You need to explain to them that this is a health and safety issue and that they need to be taking rest and meal breaks, and also that it's an obligation for you to provide that to them and they have to take it. If they're refusing to do that, then I would highly, highly recommend that you speak to somebody that's a lawyer, or, like I said, contact our NZ HR advisory service. They just dealt with this recently, and the reality is that you might need to go through a letter of expectations or a disciplinary process because they're refusing to follow your instruction and things like that. So it could just depend on the circumstance. Now, when it comes to so somebody asked, if an employee uses all their sick leave in a year, what is the default leave to be used next? Is it their annual leave? I would say no. I would say the default leave should be unpaid leave, but what you can do is a leverage. And that's the way that I normally would pitch it. So I would say to the employee, look, you would normally get unpaid sick leave for this time. However, you do have annual leave. Would you like to take that instead? Now, you can choose whether you want to go down that path. It's a bit of a slippery slope, to be honest, because if you refuse to give them annual leave, they can claim that it's, their time and they want to take it for that. But then the other side of the argument is that it's for rest and recreation. So I would say pitch the unpaid sick leave first and also give the backup of annual leave if that's something that they would like to do. Now, we're breezing through these, which is great. So I'll just read this one. So we have 3 employees who are over a certain age and they have worked for 5 months. Do we need to pay them the adult minimum wage? So we've got 3 employees who are over 17 is what they've said, and they've worked for the employer for 5 months. Do they need to pay adult minimum wage? And the reality is that yes, so once they tick over to that 6-month mark, then you need to pay them the adult minimum wage. I used to get this a lot when I worked for the hospitality sector, and it's because it's not an easy thing, it's not palatable. The fact that you've got somebody that's so so ill-equipped with experience in terms of 6 months of experience maybe in the workforce, and you've got to pay them the adult minimum wage, and then you've got other staff that have got 10 years experience and they might be just straddling a couple of dollars above the minimum wage. It's a hard place to be, but the reality is that you do actually have to provide this to the employees. I'll grab a couple more questions while we've still got a bit of time. So let me just read through this. Okay, so somebody asked if an employee is on a roster, but she wasn't rostered to work on a public holiday, and she's worked 5 out of the 6 Mondays prior to the public holiday. So let's say the public holiday fell on a Monday this time. Is that an otherwise working day? And is she entitled to public holiday or no? So in that scenario, firstly, check what's in the employment agreement. Are they a casual employee? Were they meant to only work on public holidays? Things like that will change these factors. But if you've got a stock standard situation where an employee was meant to come in on a particular day of work on a Monday, they haven't been rostered on maybe the previous Monday, but prior to that, they've been rostered on 5 out of 6 Mondays, then most likely this will be an otherwise working day. If you feel like you're not entirely sure, go back further than the 5 or 6 Mondays. Like I said, go back. Some people go back 3 months at a time. So go back and have a look and see what pattern is actually formed there. And make sure that you're checking the employment agreement. Make sure that it's not a situation where they only work on public holidays or anything like that. And what else do we have here? So if an employee's usual working day falls on a public holiday and they only work 4 of the 8 hours that day, are they entitled to time and a half for the 4 hours and normal pay for the other 4? No. So they only get, so if they come in and work on an otherwise working day, which is a public holiday, and they only do 4 hours that day, then they would only get paid time and a half for the 4 hours. And that's it. They don't get any additional pay on top of that. So whatever they're required to work is what they would get. If you need them to work 8 hours, they would get time and a half on 8 hours. So you don't need to back that up with any missing hours or anything for that day. And their lieu day would be a day that they would normally come in to work. Now, I've got a couple more questions here. So if somebody is on a fixed term arrangement and they only want to work during the school holidays, is that a genuine reason for a fixed term? Unfortunately, no. It can't be dependent on what the employee wants. I did see something that went out a while ago around that, but the general consensus has always been with the case law that it is dependent on what is a genuine business reason for the employer. And having somebody coming in during school holidays because it fits around their schedule isn't a genuine reason. What could be a genuine reason, though, is that it is the summer period, it's a busy period. Maybe they need to come in and work at a cafe, and because of that, we have an influx of work, so we want to hire somebody on a fixed term arrangement during that time. And then I've got one more question, Bernie, and then I'll probably wrap up in 1 or 2 questions. Let's just see. So, so we've got one question. So, for a company that does 9-day fortnights, are we supposed to give the public holiday um, back as in lieu that falls on their rostered day off since they already work for 80? So if that's their rostered day off and they're not normally working on those particular days, you could potentially argue that that they wouldn't get that particular public holiday. But if you can see that there is a pattern forming, and regardless of whether it was a rostered day off or something like that, if they have worked several Mondays in the past, then it could seem disingenuous and could also breach the legislation if you didn't provide them that day. But if you can see very clearly that they are on 9-day fortnights, working rotating rosters, and this is the way that it works, then there could be an argument to say that they wouldn't get that public holiday. But you have to make sure it's very clear. And I would highly recommend, if you're in that kind of situation, make sure that you get some advice around that as well. So I think that pretty much wraps up most of the questions that have come through. I wanted to also say that, look, just one thing that I want to mention is that the rules around contractors are actually changing. So just keep that in mind. I know I mentioned it a bit earlier, but there might be a new gateway test that will be introduced. It has kind of pushed its way through Parliament and been introduced just over this week. So just keep that in mind, because that could put a lot of employers' minds at ease when it comes to employment law in New Zealand and engaging contractors. So aside from that, everyone, thank you so much. I'll just bring up my details on the screen. If you want, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Like I say, I live, eat, and breathe employment law, which means that I am posting things about that. And also Employment Hero is posting lots of information in the New Zealand space. So definitely give them a follow. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much. Don't forget that this webinar is recorded and that all of this information will be sent through to you, the recording, the slides, as well as all of these bits and pieces. Now, what I'm really excited to say is that we have a webinar that's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks' time. It's actually our part 2 of our terminations webinar. I will be hosting it, so if you're okay with my screechy, croaky voice, then I am happy to be there to deliver another one on the 2nd of July, where we're going to be talking about terminations in respect of disciplinary and misconduct processes. So keep that in mind. And last bit from me, I promise, because Bernie will tell me, why did you forget about this? We always love to hear your feedback and to know what you're interested in, what you might want to see more of. Also, if you're interested in that webinar, so please make sure that you participate in our survey that's going to pop up right at the end, and make sure that you give us, a true rating. Even if it's horrible, we'll work on it and I'll do better next time, I promise. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, a lovely afternoon, and thank you for braving the cold and for sitting through my voice. I appreciate it, and take care, everyone. Bye.